Step right up to the dazzling carnival in St. Mary's Mead, where the thrilling whirlwind ride hides a deadly secret. When a wealthy merchant plummets to his death, the harness sliced with chilling precision, Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster with a knack for unraveling human nature, steps in. Was it the nervous operator, the proud engineer, the ambitious rival, or the debt-ridden worker who turned festivity into murder? In a village buzzing with whispers, every clue tightens the net. Join Miss Marple as she knits through a web of fear, pride, and betrayal to catch a killer before the carnival leaves town. Chapter 1. The Carnival's Bright Lights. In the quiet village of St. Mary's Mead, where the days unfolded with the gentle predictability of a well-worn novel, the arrival of the summer carnival was a disruption as vivid as a splash of paint on a clean canvas. The meadows beyond the vicarage, usually home to grazing sheep, had transformed into a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Tents striped in red and gold sprouted like mushrooms after rain, and the air carried the mingled scents of toffee apples, diesel, and anticipation. From her cottage window, Miss Jane Marple, her fingers deftly working a pair of knitting needles, could hear the distant calliope's jaunty tune, punctuated by the shrieks of delighted children. She pursed her lips, not entirely approving. Carnivals, with their transient glamour and hidden corners, were fertile ground for mischief, as she had observed in her many years of watching human nature. Miss Marple's cottage, with its neat rose garden and polished brass knocker, was a haven of order amid the village's sudden fervor. Her parlor-maid, Cherry, bustled in with a tray of tea, her cheeks flushed from the excitement outside. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you seen it? The carnival's got a new ride this year, the whirlwind, they call it. Ever so high it is, spins you round till you're dizzy. Everyone's talking about it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes crinkling. "I dare say it's quite a spectacle, Cherry, but I'll leave the spinning to younger folk." She returned to her knitting, a pale blue shawl for her niece's baby, her mind already turning over the carnival's arrival. She had seen such events before, in St. Mary's Mead and beyond, and they often brought more than merriment. People, when caught up in the whirl of lights and noise, sometimes revealed their truest selves, for better or worse. As the afternoon waned, the village seemed to hum with a restless energy. Miss Marple, settling into her armchair with a copy of The Times, found her concentration interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Cherry ushered in young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, his cap askew and his freckled face alight with urgency. "Miss Marple, ma'am, there's been a terrible thing at the carnival," he gasped, barely pausing for breath. "A man's gone and died on the whirlwind. Fell right out, they say. And now the police are there, and folks are saying it wasn't no accident." His words tumbled out, as if the horror of the news had outpaced his ability to order them. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her calm demeanor unshaken, but her interest keenly piqued. "Now, Tommy," she said gently, "start from the beginning. Who was this man, and what exactly happened?" Tommy, still panting, recounted what he'd heard. The victim was Mr. Harold Grayson, a well-to-do merchant from the nearby town of Much Benham, known for his prosperous trade in textiles. He'd been riding the whirlwind when, in full view of the crowd, his harness had given way, sending him plummeting to the ground. The carnival had halted, its music silenced, and Inspector Craddock, whom Miss Marple knew from past entanglements, was already on the scene, questioning the ride's operator and others. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needles in her hands, began to weave possibilities. Accidents were rare in her experience, often cloaking something more deliberate. She recalled a case in the village years ago when a seemingly innocent mishap at the church fete had masked a deeper malice. "Thank you, Tommy," she said, her voice mild, but her eyes alert. "I think I shall take a stroll to the carnival myself. One hears so much more when one sees things firsthand." Tommy, still wide-eyed, nodded and dashed off, no doubt to spread the news further. Donning her straw hat and a light shawl, Miss Marple stepped out into the warm evening, her sensible shoes tapping softly on the path. The carnival's lights blazed against the twilight, drawing villagers like moths to a flame. As she approached, she noted the crowd's murmurs, a blend of shock and morbid curiosity. The whirlwind loomed ahead, its metal arms still, like a giant frozen in mid-gesture. Police tape fluttered around it, and Inspector Craddock's familiar figure stood near a cluster of carnival folk, his notebook in hand. Miss Marple paused, her gaze sweeping the scene. There was Mr. Jenkins, the ride operator, wiping his brow with a handkerchief, his face pale under the garish lights. Nearby, Mr. Carver, the engineer who'd designed the whirlwind, stood with arms crossed, his expression defiant. Mr. Lyle, a rival merchant to the late Grayson, lingered at the edge of the crowd, his smile too polished for the occasion. And young Billy, a carnival worker with a mop of unruly hair, hovered near the ride's base, his eyes darting nervously. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. So many threads, she thought, like a tangled skein of wool, waiting to be unraveled. She stepped forward, ready to begin. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Tragedy. The carnival grounds, so recently a cacophony of laughter and music, lay under a pall of uneasy quiet as Miss Jane Marple approached. The summer evening had deepened into a soft dusk, but the garish lights of the stalls and rides still flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the trampled grass. The whirlwind, that towering monument to modern engineering, stood silent, its skeletal arms outlined against the fading sky like the bones of some great beast. Police tape, strung haphazardly around its base, fluttered in the breeze, and a small crowd of villagers lingered at a respectful distance, their whispers blending with the occasional creak of cooling metal. Miss Marple, her straw hat tilted slightly against the evening chill, moved with her characteristic unhurried grace, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Inspector Craddock, a tall man with a weary but competent air, stood near the ride's control booth, his notebook open and his pencil poised. He had worked with Miss Marple before, in cases that had left him both exasperated and admiring of her uncanny knack for seeing what others missed. Spotting her approach, he raised a hand in greeting, though his expression betrayed the weight of the task at hand. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I might have known you'd find your way here. This is a bad business, I'm afraid." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression one of polite concern. "So, I've heard, Inspector. Poor Mr. Grayson. A dreadful thing to meet one's end in such a public way. I thought I might offer my assistance, if you'll permit it." Her tone was modest, almost diffident, but Craddock knew better than to underestimate the mind behind those mild blue eyes. He nodded, gesturing toward the whirlwind. "I'd welcome your thoughts, though I warn you, it's a grim scene." The two walked toward the ride, where a tarpaulin had been laid over the spot where Harold Grayson had fallen. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the crumpled fabric, her thoughts turning to the fragility of life. Grayson, she had been told, was a man of some standing in Much Benham, a textile merchant whose shrewd dealings had amassed him a comfortable fortune. His death, so sudden and violent, seemed at odds with the Carnival's promise of carefree joy. "What do we know so far, Inspector?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. Craddock flipped through his notebook. Harold Grayson, aged 42, took the Whirlwind at about 6 this evening. The ride was in full swing, literally, I suppose, when his safety harness gave way. He fell nearly 30 feet. Death was instantaneous, the doctor says. The harness was one of those over-the-shoulder types, meant to be foolproof. But something went wrong, and I'm not convinced it was an accident. He paused, glancing at the crowd. The carnival folk are jittery, and the villagers are already spinning tales of sabotage. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing as she studied the Whirlwind. Its structure was a marvel of steel and gears, with seats suspended from rotating arms that spun riders in dizzying arcs. The harnesses, she noted, were thick straps with metal buckles, designed to secure passengers against the ride's wild motions. "Have you examined the harness itself?" she asked. "Not closely yet," Craddock admitted. "The forensic chaps are on their way from Much Benham, but I've had a quick look. It's frayed, or perhaps cut, in a way that doesn't look natural. We've secured the ride, and no one's touched it since the incident." He gestured toward a group of carnival workers standing nearby, their faces a mix of shock and suspicion. "I've got 4 people I'm looking at, based on who had access to the ride before it started." Miss Marple followed his gaze, her mind already cataloging the figures before her. There was Mr. Jenkins, the ride operator, a wiry man in his 50s with a face creased by years of sun and worry. He stood apart, twisting a greasy rag in his hands, his eyes darting toward the ride as if it might accuse him. Next was Mr. Carver, the engineer, a stocky figure with ink-stained fingers and a scowl that suggested he took the accident as a personal affront. Mr. Lyle, the rival merchant, leaned against a nearby stall, his tailored suit and easy smile at odds with the somber mood. And young Billy, the carnival worker, hovered near a stack of crates, his youthful face pale and his hands buried deep in his pockets. "An interesting group," Miss Marple murmured, her tone as light as if she were commenting on a garden party. "Each with their own reasons to be near the ride, I imagine. Tell me, Inspector, what do we know of them?" Craddock sighed, flipping another page in his notebook. "Jenkins has been with the carnival for years, running rides like this one. Says he checked every harness before the ride started, but he's nervous as a cat, which makes me wonder. Carver designed the Whirlwind himself, proud of it too, from what I hear. He's insisting the fault lies elsewhere, maybe with Jenkins's handling. Lyle, well, he's a competitor of Grayson's, in the textile trade. There's no love lost there, by all accounts. And Billy, he's just a lad, works odd jobs for the carnival. Seems scared out of his wits, but that could just be the shock." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Fear can mean many things, Inspector. Guilt, perhaps, or simply the dread of being caught in something larger than oneself. I recall a case in St. Mary's Mead, years ago, where a young man's nerves gave him away, not because he was guilty, but because he knew more than he dared say." She paused, her eyes lingering on Billy, who had begun to edge away from the crates. Shall we have a closer look at the ride? Craddock led her to the base of the whirlwind, where a ladder provided access to the seats. The ride was a complex affair, with a control booth to one side and a maintenance hatch beneath, half hidden by a tangle of cables. Miss Marple, despite her age, climbed the ladder with surprising agility, her gloved hands steady on the rungs. She examined the seat, where Grayson had sat, noting the harness's thick straps and the heavy buckle that should have held firm. The frayed edge, visible even in the dim light, was not the ragged tear of wear, but a clean, deliberate slice, as if made with a sharp blade. "Most curious," she said softly, her fingers brushing the damaged strap. "This was no accident of neglect, Inspector. Someone meant for this to happen." Craddock nodded grimly. "That's my thinking. But who? And why? Grayson wasn't the sort to make enemies, from what I've heard. A bit sharp in business, perhaps, but nothing to warrant this." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Oh, Inspector, you'd be surprised how a sharp word or a sharper deal can fester in the heart. People are rarely as simple as they seem." She descended the ladder, her mind already turning over the possibilities. The Carnival, with its transient workers and fleeting visitors, was a place where secrets could hide in plain sight. She thought of the village fete, years ago, when a seemingly trivial dispute over a cake stall had led to a theft, and, nearly, to worse. Motives, she knew, were often buried deep, like roots beneath a smooth lawn. As they returned to the ground, Miss Marple's attention shifted to the crowd. The villagers, though kept at a distance, were a rich source of information, their gossip as reliable as a barometer for trouble. She recognized Mrs. Price, the postmistress, whose tongue was as quick as her fingers at sorting letters. Approaching her, Miss Marple adopted her most disarming smile. "Good evening, Mrs. Price. Such a dreadful business, isn't it? I suppose you've heard all sorts of talk about poor Mr. Grayson." Mrs. Price, eager to share, leaned closer. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's shocking. They're saying the ride was tampered with, and who can blame them? That Mr. Lyle, you know, he was no friend of Grayson's. I heard they had words last week over some contract or other, and that young Billy, always skulking about. My nephew saw him near the ride last night, long after the carnival closed." She lowered her voice, her eyes gleaming. "And Mr. Jenkins, well, he's been drinking more than usual, hasn't he? My cousin's boy works at the pub, and he says Jenkins was there till all hours, muttering about trouble." Miss Marple listened, her face a mask of polite interest, though her mind was sorting these fragments like pieces of a jigsaw. "How very interesting," she said. "And Mr. Carver, surely a man so proud of his work would be devastated by this." Mrs. Price sniffed. "Proud, yes, but touchy. Grayson laughed at his designs once, called them fancy toys. Carver didn't take kindly to that, I can tell you." She bustled off to share her theories with others, leaving Miss Marple to ponder. Returning to Craddock, Miss Marple shared what she'd heard. "It seems, Inspector, that our suspects are not without their shadows. Mr. Lyle's rivalry, Mr. Carver's wounded pride, Mr. Jenkins's nerves, and young Billy's late-night wanderings, all threads in a tapestry that's yet to take shape." She glanced at the whirlwind, its silent menace looming above. "I think, perhaps, a closer look at these gentlemen's movements might be in order. People, you know, are often betrayed by the smallest things, a glance, a pause, a tool left out of place." Craddock nodded, though his expression was skeptical. You make it sound simple, Miss Marple, but this lot's a tangle. Jenkins swears he checked the harnesses, Carver's blaming everyone but himself, Lyle's too smooth by half, and Billy, well, he's barely said a word. Where do we start? Miss Marple's smile was serene, but her eyes were sharp. With observation, Inspector, people cannot help but reveal themselves if one watches closely enough. I think I shall have a word with Mr. Jenkins first. He seems the most unsettled, and unsettled people often let slip more than they intend. She adjusted her shawl, her mind already mapping the paths ahead. The carnival, with its bright lights and hidden corners, was a stage for human folly, and Miss Marple was no stranger to its dramas. As she moved toward Jenkins, her steps were light, but her purpose was as steady as the ticking of a clock. Chapter 3. The Operator's Tale. The carnival grounds, though subdued by the tragedy, still hummed with the restless energy of a place caught between festivity and suspicion. The evening air carried a faint chill, and the lights of the stalls flickered like uncertain stars against the deepening sky. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat a pale beacon in the dusk, made her way toward the refreshment tent, where Mr. Jenkins, the ride operator, had agreed to meet her. She moved with the quiet deliberation of one who knew that truth often hid in the pauses between words, and her mind was already threading together the fragments of the day's observations. The whirlwind loomed behind her, its silent arms a stark reminder of Harold Grayson's fate, and she felt the weight of the puzzle before her, a puzzle not of gears and straps, but of human hearts and their hidden motives. The refreshment tent was a modest affair, its canvas walls sagging slightly under the weight of recent rain. Inside, a few rickety tables were scattered about, surrounded by the mingled scents of strong tea and slightly stale cakes. Mr. Jenkins sat alone at a corner table, his wiry frame hunched over a chipped mug, his fingers twisting the greasy rag he seemed never to part with. His face, lined and weathered, bore the look of a man who had spent too many years squinting into the sun, and his eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or the strain of a secret held too close. "Good evening, Mr. Jenkins," Miss Marple said, settling herself opposite him with a smile that was both gentle and disarming. "How kind of you to spare a moment. I imagine this has been a trying day for you." Jenkins nodded, his hands tightening around the rag. "Trying ain't the half of it, miss," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. 20 years I've been running rides, from here to Blackpool and back, and never a soul hurt on my watch. And now this, Mr. Grayson, dead, and folks looking at me like I'm to blame." He shook his head, his eyes darting toward the tent's entrance, as if expecting an accuser to appear. Miss Marple's expression was one of quiet sympathy, though her mind was as alert as ever. She had seen men like Jenkins before, hard-working, proud of their craft, yet vulnerable to the weight of suspicion. In St. Mary's Mead, there had been a gardener once, accused of theft after a silver spoon vanished from the vicarage. His nerves had betrayed not guilt, but the fear of being misjudged. "It must be dreadful," she said, her voice soft, "to have such a thing happen under your care. You checked the harnesses, I understand?" "Everyone," Jenkins said firmly, though his hands trembled slightly. "Before each run, I go over 'em, straps, buckles, all of it. That whirlwind's a beast, but I know her inside out. I checked Mr. Grayson's seat myself, not 10 minutes before he went up. It was sound, I swear it. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. But someone's been at it, miss. That harness didn't break on its own. Someone cut it, or near enough. Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had produced from her bag as a matter of habit, clicked softly as she worked a row of pale blue wool. The sound seemed to steady Jenkins, as she had intended. "A serious accusation, Mr. Jenkins," she said, her tone mild, but her eyes sharp. "Have you any idea who might have done such a thing? Someone with access to the ride, perhaps?" Jenkins hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the tent's entrance again. Outside, the carnival's lights cast fleeting shadows, and Miss Marple noted the figure of Mr. Lyle, the rival merchant, passing by, his silhouette sharp in a tailored coat. Jenkins's jaw tightened. "I don't like to point fingers, miss," he said, "but there's them that didn't care for Mr. Grayson. That Mr. Lyle, for one. He was hanging about the rides last night, after hours. I saw him myself, near the Whirlwind's maintenance shed. Didn't think much of it then, but now—" He trailed off, his fingers twisting the rag into a knot. Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained serene. "Mr. Lyle, you say? How curious. And what was he doing, if you don't mind my asking?" Jenkins shrugged, his unease palpable. "Just standing there, like he was waiting for someone. I was locking up, see, and I called out to him, asked if he needed help. He said no, just taking a stroll. But he looked, I don't know, sly, like. And then there's young Billy, always poking about where he shouldn't. He's a good lad, mind, but he's got debts, they say, and Grayson wasn't one to let a debt slide." Miss Marple nodded, filing away these details. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a young man's late-night wanderings had led to a misunderstanding, though not, in that instance, to murder. "And Mr. Carver, the engineer?" she prompted gently. "He must be dreadfully upset, with his creation under scrutiny." Jenkins snorted, a flash of disdain crossing his face. "Carver? He's all bluster, that one. Thinks his Whirlwind's the eighth wonder, but he's not above cutting corners. Left the maintenance hatch unlocked last night, I noticed. Anyone could have got in there, miss, and he'd be none the wiser." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "But I'll tell you this. I didn't touch that harness, and I didn't see nothing out of place till it was too late." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to the hum of voices outside. She observed Jenkins closely, noting the sweat on his brow, the way his hands never stilled. Fear, she thought, but of what? Guilt, or the dread of being falsely accused? "You've been most helpful, Mr. Jenkins," she said, her voice warm. "It's a terrible thing, to have one's work questioned. I'm sure the truth will come out, as it always does." As she rose to leave, Jenkins's voice stopped. "Miss," he said, almost a whisper, "you'll tell the inspector I did my job, won't you? I don't want folks thinking I'm careless." His eyes, for a moment, held a plea that struck Miss Marple as genuine, though she knew better than to trust first impressions alone. Outside the tent, the carnival was winding down, its stalls shuttering for the night. Miss Marple paused, her gaze sweeping the grounds. Mr. Lyle was still visible, now speaking with a group of villagers, his charm as polished as ever. She thought of Jenkins' words, Lyle near the maintenance shed, and Billy with his debts, and Carver, whose pride in his work might mask a deeper flaw. The Whirlwind stood silent, its secrets locked in steel and shadow, but Miss Marple knew that secrets, like stitches, could be unraveled with patience. She adjusted her shawl and set off toward her cottage, her mind already turning to the next thread in the tapestry. Chapter 4. The Engineer's Defense. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary's Mead, softening the edges of the Carnival's gaudy sprawl, but doing little to dispel the shadow of the previous day's tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, made her way to the edge of the village, where Mr. Carver, the engineer of the ill-fated Whirlwind, kept a small workshop. The air was crisp, scented with dew, and the faint tang of engine oil that lingered around the carnival grounds. Miss Marple's steps were measured, her straw hat shielding her eyes from the light, but her mind was as active as ever, piecing together the fragments of suspicion that had begun to form. Mr. Jenkins's nervous accusations, the whispers of rivalry, and the silent menace of the sabotaged ride all pointed to a truth that lay hidden, like a flaw in a seemingly perfect fabric. The workshop was a low, corrugated shed, its walls streaked with rust and its windows clouded with grime. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of metal and grease, and the cluttered space was a testament to a man consumed by his craft. Blueprints and schematics covered every surface, pinned haphazardly to boards or curling at the edges on a cluttered desk. Tools glinted in the dim light, scattered as if abandoned mid-task. Mr. Carver stood at the far end, hunched over a drafting table, his broad shoulders tense and his ink-stained fingers gripping a pencil. He was a stocky man, with a face that might have been handsome, but for the scowl that seemed permanently etched into it. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and his eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a mix of irritation and defensiveness. "Good morning, Mr. Carver," Miss Marple said, her voice as mild as a spring breeze. "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought it might be helpful to speak with you about the Whirlwind, such a remarkable creation by all accounts." Carver straightened, his scowl deepening, though he gestured to a stool with grudging courtesy. "Remarkable, yes," he said brusquely. "And flawless, I'll have you know. That accident wasn't my doing. If you're here to point fingers, you're wasting your time." His voice was gruff, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands as he set down his pencil, a sign of strain that belied his bluster. She settled onto the stool, her knitting needles emerging almost instinctively from her bag. The soft click of the needles seemed to fill the silence, and she saw Carver's shoulders relax, if only slightly. "Oh, I'm not here to accuse anyone, Mr. Carver," she said, her tone gentle but her eyes keen. "I'm merely an old woman with a curiosity about how things work. The Whirlwind is such a complex machine, isn't it? You must be very proud of it." Carver's expression softened, though his guard remained up. "Proud? I should say so. Took me 2 years to design her, every gear, every bolt, calculated to perfection. She's the fastest ride this side of London, and safer than a church pew, or she was meant to be." He jabbed a finger toward a blueprint on the wall, a dizzying array of lines and annotations. "That harness system? My design? Triple redundant straps, tested to withstand twice the force of the ride's maximum spin. If it failed, it wasn't the design. Someone tampered with it. Mark my words." Miss Marple's needles paused as she tilted her head, her expression one of polite interest. "Tampered, you say? That's a serious matter. And who might have had the opportunity, do you think? Someone familiar with the ride's workings, perhaps?" She watched him closely, noting the way. His eyes flicked toward the door, as if expecting an interruption. Carver snorted, crossing his arms. Jenkins, for one. He's the operator, supposed to check the harnesses before every run. If he missed something, or worse, didn't bother, that's on him. I told him 100 times, check the buckles, check the straps, don't just glance and call it done. But he's lazy, always has been. His voice carried a bitter edge, and Miss Marple wondered if it stemmed from professional rivalry or something deeper. She nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. Mr. Jenkins did seem rather shaken when I spoke with him, she said. He mentioned the maintenance hatch being left unlocked the night before the accident. Could someone have gained access to the ride then, do you think? Carver's face darkened, his jaw tightening. Unlocked? That's nonsense. I lock that hatch myself every night. If it was open, someone forced it, or Jenkins is lying to cover his own sloppiness. He hesitated, then added, though I'll admit, I was in a rush that evening. Had a meeting in Much Benham, didn't get back till late. I suppose it's possible I forgot, but I'd wager my reputation it was secure. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her face remained serene. A reputation is a precious thing, Mr. Carver, she said. I understand Mr. Grayson once questioned your work, something about calling your designs fancy toys. She spoke lightly, as if recalling a trivial anecdote, but she watched his reaction with care. Carver's scowl returned, fiercer than before. Grayson, he spat, the name like a curse. Yes, he said that, at a trade fair last year. Thought he was clever, mocking my work in front of half the county. He didn't know a rivet from a bolt, but he had money, so people listened. I didn't take kindly to it, I'll admit, but I'd hardly kill a man over a few words. His hands clenched into fists, and Miss Marple noted the controlled anger in his posture, like a spring coiled too tightly. Of course not, she said soothingly. Words can sting, though, can't they? I remember a gentleman in St. Mary's Mead, a florist, who took great offense when his roses were called common. It led to quite a feud, though thankfully no one was hurt. She smiled, as if lost in reminiscence, but her mind was cataloging every nuance of Carver's response. Pride, she knew, could be as potent a motive as greed or fear, and Carver's pride in his whirlwind was as clear as the blueprints on his walls. She shifted the conversation, her voice still gentle. Tell me, Mr. Carver, who else might have known how to tamper with the harness? It seems such a precise act, requiring some knowledge of the ride's mechanics. Carver hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Anyone with half a brain could figure it out, if they got close enough. The harnesses aren't complicated. Cut a strap in the right place, and it'll give under strain. But it'd take nerve and access. Jenkins, Billy, maybe even Lyle. He used to tinker with machines before he turned to trade. He's got the know-how, and he hated Grayson's guts. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. I saw Lyle near the ride 2 nights ago, poking about like he owned the place. Didn't like the look of him, I can tell you. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a counterpoint to the tension in the room. Mr. Lyle does seem to have a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, she said. And young Billy? He's rather young for such a calculated act, wouldn't you say? Carver shrugged, his scowl softening into something like disdain. Billy's a kid, all right, but kids can be desperate. Heard he owed Grayson money. Gambling, they say. Desperation makes people do funny things. He turned back to his blueprint, as if dismissing the conversation, but Miss Marple sensed a lingering unease in his abruptness. She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Carver," she said, her smile as warm as ever. "I'm sure the inspector will get to the bottom of this, and your whirlwind will be cleared of any fault." She paused at the door, turning slightly. "One last thing. Do you recall what time you left the carnival that night? It might help to narrow things down." Carver's eyes flickered, but he answered readily enough. "Around 7 for my meeting. Back by 10, locked everything up tight, or so I thought." His tone was defensive, but Miss Marple merely nodded, her mind already turning to the possibilities. A forgotten lock, a late-night visitor, a cut strap. The pieces were there, waiting to be stitched together. As she stepped out into the morning light, the carnival grounds were coming to life again, though the whirlwind remained cordoned off. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the ride, its silent arms a challenge to her understanding. Carver's pride, Jenkins's fear, Lyle's ambition, Billy's debts, each was a thread in a tapestry that was slowly taking shape. She thought of a seamstress in St. Mary's Mead, whose careful stitches had hidden a theft. The truth, she knew, often lay in the smallest details. With a quiet resolve, she set off to find Inspector Craddock, her mind already weaving the next steps in her inquiry. Chapter 5. The Rival's Ambition. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary's Mead, its warmth doing little to dispel the unease that clung to the village like morning mist. The carnival, though open for business, moved with a subdued rhythm, its usual clamor muted by the shadow of Harold Grayson's death. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, walked the short distance from Mr. Carver's workshop to the village proper, her mind turning over the threads of suspicion she had gathered. Mr. Jenkins's nervous accusations, Mr. Carver's defensive pride, and the whispers of late-night wanderings all pointed to a deliberate act, but the motive remained elusive, like a pattern half seen in a tangled skein. Her next destination was the Blue Boar, the village pub, where Mr. Lyle, Grayson's rival, was said to hold court, his charm as much a fixture as the polished bar. The Blue Boar was a sturdy, timbered building, its windows glowing with the soft light of oil lamps even in the daytime. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ale and pipe smoke, and a low hum of conversation filled the room. Miss Marple stepped inside, her straw hat a quiet contrast to the raucous energy of the pub. She spotted Mr. Lyle at once, seated at a corner table with a group of villagers, his laughter ringing out as he handed round pints with a generous hand. He was a man in his 40s, with a sharp jaw and sharper eyes, dressed in a suit that spoke of city wealth rather than village simplicity. His dark hair was neatly slicked, and his smile, though warm, had a calculated edge that Miss Marple noted with interest. She approached, her manner as unassuming as ever. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lyle," she said, her voice carrying the gentle cadence of polite inquiry. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm Miss Marple, from the village. I wondered if I might have a word about poor Mr. Grayson." Lyle's smile did not falter, though his eyes flicked over her, assessing. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said, rising with a flourish to offer her a chair. "A terrible loss, Grayson's passing. Please, join us. Can I get you a cup of tea, or something stronger?" His tone was smooth, almost too smooth, and Miss Marple sensed the practiced ease of a man accustomed to winning favor. "Tea would be lovely, thank you," she said, settling into the chair with a small nod of thanks. As Lyle signaled the barmaid, Miss Marple observed the villagers at the table, a farmer, a shopkeeper, and a young woman from the post office, all hanging on Lyle's words. He had a knack for making each feel important, she noted, a skill that could mask darker intentions. She thought of a charming curate in St. Mary's Mead, whose easy manner had hidden a penchant for petty theft, and wondered what lay beneath Lyle's polished exterior. The tea arrived, steaming in a chipped cup, and Miss Marple sipped it delicately, her knitting needles emerging from her bag as if by habit. The soft click of the needles seemed to steady the air, and she smiled at Lyle. "You knew Mr. Grayson well, I understand," she said. "Such a shock, his accident on the Whirlwind. The village is quite abuzz with theories." Lyle leaned back, his expression one of studied sorrow. "A tragedy, no question," he said. "Harold and I were competitors, of course, in the textile trade, but I respected him. He had a sharp mind for business, even if we didn't always see eye to eye." His voice was measured, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting hardness in his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Competition can be trying, can't it?" she said, her tone light. "I recall a pair of grocers in St. Mary's Mead, always vying for custom. It led to such tension, though thankfully nothing so dreadful as this. I understand you and Mr. Grayson had a recent disagreement. Over a contract, perhaps?" Lyle's smile tightened, though he covered it with a sip of his ale. "Oh, you've heard the gossip, have you?" "Yes, we had words about a contract, a big order from a London firm. Grayson undercut me, as he often did. It's the nature of the game, Miss Marple. No hard feelings." He spread his hands as if to dismiss the matter, but Miss Marple noted the slight clench of his fingers, the way his eyes darted toward the door. She nodded, her needles clicking steadily. "Of course, business is business, though I've heard you were seen near the Carnival grounds the night before the accident, near the Whirlwind. Taking a stroll, perhaps?" Her question was gentle, almost casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any crack in his composure. Lyle's laugh was a shade too hearty. "A stroll, exactly. I like to know what's what, you see. The Carnival's a big draw for the village, and I'm always looking for opportunities. I wandered by the rides, yes, but I didn't touch a thing, just admiring the setup." He leaned forward, his charm returning like a well-rehearsed line. "You don't think I'd meddle with a ride, do you? I'm a businessman, not a mechanic." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "Oh, I'm sure you're far too busy for such things, Mr. Lyle. Though I understand you have some experience with machinery from your early days, before you turned to trade, wasn't it?" She spoke as if recalling a trivial fact, but she had learned from Mrs. Price that Lyle had trained as an engineer before inheriting his father's business, a detail that had piqued her interest. Lyle's eyes narrowed, though his smile held. "You've done your homework, Miss Marple. Yes, I dabbled in engineering years ago, but I haven't touched a wrench in a decade. My talents lie elsewhere now." He gestured to the villagers, who nodded eagerly, as if to confirm his importance. Miss Marple noted their loyalty, or perhaps their susceptibility to his generosity, and filed it away. The conversation turned to lighter matters, with Lyle regaling the table with tales of his travels, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She thought of Lyle's presence at the Carnival, his engineering knowledge, and the contract that had slipped through his fingers. Ambition, she knew, could drive men to desperate acts, and Lyle's polished exterior might conceal a sharper edge. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a charming newcomer had swindled half the village before his true nature was revealed. Charm? she mused, was often a mask for calculation. As she finished her tea, Miss Marple rose, thanking Lyle for his time. "You've been most kind, Mr. Lyle," she said. "I'm sure the inspector will sort this out, and we'll all rest easier knowing the truth." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "It's curious, isn't it? How small things, a late-night walk, a misplaced tool, can change everything." Lyle's smile flickered, but he recovered quickly. "Curious indeed, Miss Marple. I hope you'll come by the carnival again. I'd hate for this tragedy to spoil the fun." His tone was warm, but Miss Marple sensed a challenge beneath it, as if he knew she was probing deeper than she let on. She stepped out into the sunlight, the pub's warmth giving way to the fresh air of the village. The carnival lay just beyond, its rides turning slowly, but the whirlwind remained still, a silent accusation. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lyle's words, his easy dismissal of the contract dispute, and his presence near the ride. She thought of the harness, its clean cut suggesting not just intent, but skill. Lyle's engineering past, however distant, was a thread she could not ignore. As she walked toward her cottage, her knitting bag swinging gently, she resolved to speak with young Billy next. The tapestry was taking shape, and each conversation added a new stitch, bringing the pattern closer to clarity. Chapter 6. The Worker's Secret. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary's Mead, casting long shadows across the carnival grounds, where the air still carried the faint sweetness of candy floss and the sharper tang of metal. The rides spun on, their music a hollow echo of the previous day's gaiety, but the whirlwind stood motionless, its police tape fluttering like a warning flag. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar weight on her arm, picked her way through the thinning crowd, her eyes searching for young Billy, the carnival worker whose nervous demeanor had caught her attention. Her conversations with Jenkins, Carver, and Lyle had woven a complex web of motives, fear, pride, ambition. But Billy, with his furtive glances and whispered debts, was a loose thread she could not ignore. Human nature, she knew, often revealed itself in the young, whose secrets were less guarded, like stitches yet to be secured. She found Billy near the edge of the grounds, polishing the brass fittings of a smaller ride, his movements quick and mechanical. He was a lanky lad, no more than 19, with a mop of unruly brown hair and eyes that darted like a startled deer's. His overalls were stained with grease, and his hands, though busy with a rag, trembled slightly as he worked. Miss Marple approached with her usual unhurried grace, her straw hat tilted against the sun's glare, and her smile as warm as a vicarage tea. "Good afternoon, Billy," she said, her voice gentle but carrying that quiet authority that made people pause. "You're working hard, I see. It must be quite a task, keeping all these machines shining." Billy started, nearly dropping his rag, and turned to face her. His cheeks flushed and his eyes flicked toward the whirlwind before returning to her. "Oh, afternoon, miss," he stammered, his voice high with nerves. "Just doing my job, you know. Gotta keep things tidy." He resumed polishing, though his efforts were more frantic than effective. Miss Marple settled onto a nearby bench, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with their familiar soft click. The sound seemed to ease the tension in the air, and she saw Billy's shoulders relax, if only a fraction. "It's a fine thing to take pride in one's work," she said. "I knew a lad in St. Mary's Mead, much like you, who tended the church organ. He polished every pipe until it gleamed, but he was always so nervous. Turned out he'd borrowed money he couldn't repay. It weighed on him terribly. Her tone was conversational, almost reminiscent, but her eyes were sharp, watching Billy's reaction. The boy's hands faltered, and he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I don't know nothing about that, miss," he said too quickly. "I just clean and fetch, that's all. Don't touch the big rides, not like the whirlwind." His voice cracked on the last word, and he turned away, scrubbing at the brass with renewed vigor. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a soothing counterpoint to his agitation. "Of course, Billy," she said, "though it must be difficult, working so close to such a tragedy. Poor Mr. Grayson. I hear you knew him, perhaps better than most?" She let the question hang, her expression one of kindly concern, but her mind alert for any slip. Billy's rag slowed, and he glanced at her, his eyes wide with something like panic. "Knew him? Not really, miss. I mean, I saw him about, him being from Much Benham and all. He came to the carnival sometimes, liked to talk big, but I didn't know him proper." His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple noted the way. His hands twisted the rag, much as Jenkins had done, though with a youthful desperation that was all his own. She nodded, her needles never pausing. "It's curious, isn't it, how small things can loom large? I heard from someone, Mrs. Price, I think, that you were seen near the whirlwind the night before the accident. Just checking things, perhaps?" Her tone was gentle, but the question was precise, like a needle threading through fabric. Billy's face paled, and he dropped the rag, stooping quickly to retrieve it. I was just doing my rounds, miss, making sure the rides were locked up like Mr. Jenkins told me. I didn't go near the harnesses or nothing." His voice rose, and he glanced around, as if fearing eavesdroppers. The carnival was quieter now, with most visitors drawn to the brighter stalls, but Miss Marple sensed his fear was not just of being overheard. "There's no need to fret, Billy," she said, her voice as calming as a lullaby. "I'm sure you were just doing your job, though it must be hard, working for the carnival, with so many responsibilities. And I hear Mr. Grayson could be firm about money owed to him." She paused, letting the words settle, and saw a flicker of dread cross Billy's face. He hesitated, his hands twisting the rag into a tight knot. He wasn't kind, miss," he said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "I owed him a bit, from cards, not much, but he kept on about it. Said he'd tell my boss if I didn't pay up quick. I was going to, honest, but I wouldn't." He stopped, his eyes darting to the whirlwind again, and Miss Marple saw the weight of his fear, like a boy caught stealing apples. She leaned forward slightly, her expression one of grandmotherly concern. "I'm sure you meant no harm, Billy," she said. "Debts can be such a burden, can't they? In St. Mary's Mead, there was a young man who got into trouble over a debt to a local farmer. He was so frightened, he nearly did something foolish. But he told the truth in the end, and it all came right. Sometimes telling someone what you know can lift that weight." Billy's eyes met hers, and for a moment she thought he might confess something more. But he shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I don't know nothing, miss. I just work here. I didn't touch that harness, I swear." His voice was firm, but his hands trembled, and Miss Marple noted the sheen of sweat on his brow, despite the cool air. She rose, tucking her knitting back into her bag. "You've been very kind to talk to me, Billy," she said. I'm sure the inspector will find the truth, and you'll feel better for it. If you remember anything, even something small, you might tell me, or Inspector Craddock. It's the small things that matter, you know." She smiled, but her eyes held his, and she saw a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps, or simply the terror of being caught in a web not of his making. As she walked away, the carnival's lights began to glow against the gathering dusk, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the grass. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Billy's words, his fear, and the debt that hung over him like a storm cloud. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a young woman's desperation over a debt had led to a rash act, though not so grave as murder. Billy's youth made him an unlikely killer, but his presence near the whirlwind and his fear of Grayson were threads she could not dismiss. She thought of Lyle's engineering skill, Carver's pride, Jenkins' nerves, and now Billy's secrets, each a stitch in a pattern that was growing clearer. With a quiet resolve, she set her sights on the whirlwind itself, determined to examine it with Inspector Craddock. The truth, she knew, was often hidden in the smallest details, like a dropped stitch in a perfect shawl. Chapter 7. The Mechanics of Murder. The late afternoon light bathed St. Mary's Mead in a golden haze, softening the edges of the carnival's garish sprawl. But the whirlwind stood stark against the sky, its motionless arms a grim sentinel over the village's unease. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, walked beside Inspector Craddock toward the cordoned-off ride, her straw hat shielding her eyes from the sun's glare. Her conversations with Jenkins, Carver, Lyle, and Billy had spun a web of motives, fear, pride, ambition, desperation. But the heart of the mystery lay in the machine itself, its sabotaged harness a silent witness to a calculated act. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needles in her bag, was already threading together the clues, seeking the pattern that would reveal the killer's hand. The carnival grounds were quieter now, with most visitors drawn to the brighter attractions, leaving the whirlwind isolated behind its fluttering police tape. Craddock, his notebook tucked under his arm, ducked under the tape and gestured for Miss Marple to follow. "The forensic team's been delayed," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Some mix-up in Much Benham, but I've had a closer look at the harness, and I'd value your thoughts, Miss Marple. You've a way of seeing things I miss." Miss Marple's lips curved in a modest smile, though her eyes were alert. "You're too kind, Inspector," she said. "I'm merely an old woman with a habit of noticing details, but machines, like people, have their stories, don't they? Let's see what this one tells us." She approached the ride with her characteristic unhurried grace, her gaze sweeping over its towering structure. Steel arms gleaming, gears silent, seats frozen mid-arc. The harness that had failed Harold Grayson was still in place, marked with a tag from Craddock's team, its straps dangling like a broken promise. Craddock led her to the seat where Grayson had sat, a narrow platform suspended high above the ground. A ladder provided access, and Miss Marple, with surprising agility for her years, climbed it carefully, her gloved hands steady on the rungs. She settled beside the seat, her knitting bag resting on her lap, and examined the harness closely. The thick canvas strap, designed to hold a passenger secure against the ride's wild spins, bore a single, clean cut, barely an inch long, just above the buckle. It was not the ragged tear of wear or accident, but a deliberate slice made with a sharp blade, precise enough to weaken the strap without breaking it outright. Under the strain of the ride's centrifugal force, it had given way, sending Grayson to his death. "Most deliberate," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers brushing the cut edge. "This was no hasty act, Inspector. Whoever did this knew exactly where to cut and how to make it look like a failure of the material." She leaned closer, noting a faint smudge of grease near the cut, almost invisible against the strap's dark weave. "And this mark, perhaps from a tool or a glove. It suggests someone worked quickly, but with care." Craddock nodded, his face grim. "That's my thinking. The cut's too clean for an accident, and the grease could point to someone with access to the maintenance shed. Jenkins swears he checked the harnesses, but he's shaky. Carver insists his design is flawless, but he admitted the shed might have been unlocked. Lyle and Billy were both seen near the ride that night, Lyle with his engineering know-how, Billy with his debts. Any one of them could have done it, but we've no hard evidence yet." Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, clicking softly as she began a row of pale blue wool. The sound seemed to steady the air, and she tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "A machine like this is a marvel, isn't it?" she said. "So many parts, all working together, yet one small flaw can bring it all to ruin. It reminds me of a clock in St. Mary's Mead. At the vicarage, it kept perfect time until someone tampered with a single gear. The fault was tiny, but the result was chaos. Whoever cut this harness knew its weakness, and that suggests knowledge, perhaps of engineering, or at least of this ride's design." Craddock jotted a note, his brow furrowed. "So we're looking for someone with mechanical skill. Carver's the obvious one. He built the thing. But Lyle's got that engineering background, even if he downplays it. Billy's just a lad, but he's around the rides all day. Could have picked up enough to know where to cut. Jenkins, too, knows the whirlwind better than most." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the maintenance shed, a low structure half hidden by cables and crates at the ride's base. "The shed, Inspector," she said. "Mr. Jenkins mentioned it was unlocked, and Mr. Carver admitted he might have forgotten to secure it. Could we take a look? It might tell us more about who came and went that night." Craddock led the way, pushing open the shed's door, which creaked on rusty hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, and tools lay scattered on a workbench. A wrench, a screwdriver, a pair of pliers, and a small knife with a blade sharp enough to slice canvas. Shelves held cans of grease and spare parts, and a dusty floor bore faint footprints, though they were too smudged to identify. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the knife, its handle worn but clean, as if recently wiped. "This could be our tool," she said softly, "though I suspect the person who used it was careful to leave no trace." Craddock picked up the knife, examining it under the shed's dim bulb. "No blood, no fibers that I can see, but it's sharp enough for the job. I'll have it sent for testing, though I doubt we'll find much. Whoever did this was clever, knew how to cover their tracks." He glanced at Miss Marple, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "You're thinking it's one of our four, aren't you? But which one?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her expression serene, but her mind racing. "People are not so different from machines, Inspector," she said. "They have their weaknesses, their points of strain. Mr. Jenkins is afraid, perhaps of being blamed, or perhaps of something he saw. Mr. Carver's pride is his strength, but also his vulnerability. Grayson's mockery stung him deeply. Mr. Lyle's ambition burns bright, and losing that contract to Grayson may have pushed him to act. And Billy, poor Billy, his debt to Grayson is a weight he cannot bear alone. Each has a reason, and each had opportunity if the shed was indeed unlocked. She paused, her eyes narrowing as she studied the shed's interior. A scrap of fabric, barely noticeable, caught her attention, snagged on a nail near the door. It was a tiny piece of blue cotton, frayed at the edges, and she pointed it out to Craddock. "This might be nothing," she said, "but it could belong to someone who was here. Billy wears overalls, doesn't he? And Mr. Lyle's suits are always so fine, though he might have worn something less conspicuous for a late-night task." Craddock bagged the scrap, his expression thoughtful. "It's a start. I'll check it against their clothing, though it's a long shot. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. If I didn't know better, I'd think you'd been a detective all your life." Miss Marple's smile was modest, though her eyes twinkled. "Merely an observer of human nature, Inspector. In St. Mary's Mead, one learns to notice the small things. A glance, a hesitation, a tool out of place. They tell a story if one listens." She stepped out of the shed, the carnival's lights beginning to glow against the twilight. The whirlwind loomed above, its secrets locked in steel and silence, but Miss Marple felt the pattern growing clearer. The cut harness, the unlocked shed, the grease smudge, the scrap of fabric. Each was a stitch in a tapestry that pointed to a deliberate hand. With a quiet resolve, she turned to Craddock. "I think, Inspector, we should speak to the villagers next. They see more than they realize, and their gossip may hold the key to who entered this shed." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple's thoughts wove through the possibilities, her needles clicking in her bag like a metronome of truth. The killer, she knew, was close, and the smallest detail would unravel their carefully spun plan. Chapter 8. A Village Whisper. The twilight settled over St. Mary's Mead like a soft shawl, its gentle hues at odds with the undercurrent of suspicion that rippled through the village. The carnival's lights twinkled in the distance, but their cheer was dimmed by the shadow of Harold Grayson's death, and the whirlwind remained a silent monument to the tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar companion, walked the familiar path to her cottage, her mind weaving through the clues she had gathered. The cut harness, the unlocked maintenance shed, the smudge of grease, and the scrap of blue cotton were all threads in a tapestry that pointed to deliberate malice, but the pattern was not yet complete. Her conversations with Jenkins, Carver, Lyle, and Billy had revealed motives: fear, pride, ambition, desperation. But the truth, she knew, often lay in the chatter of those who watched from the sidelines. Villagers, with their sharp eyes and sharper tongues, were a wellspring of insight, and Miss Marple resolved to tap it. She reached her cottage, where the roses glowed faintly in the dusk, and found Mrs. Dolly Bantry waiting on the doorstep, her round face alight with the eager anticipation of gossip. Mrs. Bantry, a friend of many years, had a knack for collecting the village's whispers, sifting through them with the enthusiasm of a child hunting Easter eggs. "Jane," she exclaimed, bustling forward as Miss Marple unlocked the door. "I heard you were at the carnival again, poking about that dreadful business with Mr. Grayson. The whole village is talking, and I simply had to come and see what you've learned." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as serene as ever, and ushered her friend inside. "You're just in time for tea, Dolly," she said, setting her knitting bag on the table. "And I'd be glad of your thoughts. The village always knows more than it thinks, doesn't it? Come, tell me what you've heard." She busied herself with the kettle, her movements unhurried, but her mind alert for the nuggets of truth buried in Mrs. Bantry's chatter. The sitting room was a cozy haven, with chintz curtains and a fire crackling in the grate. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles emerging to work a row of pale blue wool, their soft click a soothing backdrop as Mrs. Bantry launched into her tale. "Oh, Jane, it's all anyone can talk about," she said, her eyes wide. "That whirlwind business. Everyone's saying it was no accident. Mrs. Price, at the post office, swears she saw Mr. Lyle arguing with Grayson just last week, outside the Blue Boar. Something about a contract, she said, and Lyle looked furious, positively red in the face. And then there's young Billy, skulking about the carnival like a cat in a storm. My maid's cousin saw him near the rides the night before, long after dark. What was he doing, I ask you?" Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained placid. "How very interesting," she said. "Mr. Lyle does seem to have a temper, doesn't he? And Billy, such a nervous boy. Did your maid's cousin say anything more about him?" She sipped her tea, her eyes meeting Mrs. Bantry's over the rim of the cup, encouraging her to spill every detail. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She did, Jane. Said Billy was near the whirlwind's shed, looking all furtive, like he was up to no good. And then there's Mr. Jenkins, drinking himself silly at the pub these past few nights. My gardener's boy says he overheard Jenkins muttering about trouble and someone meddling. And as for Mr. Carver, well, everyone knows he's touchy about his precious ride. Grayson made a fool of him once, called his designs child's play. At a fair, Carver's not the sort to forget that, is he?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing each tidbit. The village's gossip, though often embellished, was like a quilt stitched from scraps, imperfect but revealing in its patterns. Lyle's argument, Billy's late-night presence, Jenkins's drinking, Carver's grudge, all echoed what she had heard, but with new nuances. She thought of a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a servant's idle chatter about a missing brooch had unraveled a theft. "It's curious, Dolly," she said, "how much people see without realizing. Did anyone mention what Mr. Lyle was doing at the carnival that night? I heard he was seen near the rides." Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed. "Oh, yes, Mrs. Price's nephew, who helps at the carnival, said he saw Lyle near the whirlwind 2 nights ago, carrying a small bag, tools, perhaps, or something else. He didn't stop to chat, just hurried off when he saw he was noticed. And Jane, you'll never guess, Mrs. Harmon, the vicar's wife, said she overheard Lyle telling someone at the pub that Grayson's success was unnatural, whatever that means. Sounds like jealousy to me." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her thoughts racing. A tool bag, a heated argument, a hint of envy. These were stitches in a pattern that pointed to Lyle's ambition, but she knew better than to leap to conclusions. "Jealousy is a powerful thing," she said. "In St. Mary's Mead, there was a woman who envied her neighbor's roses so much she poisoned their roots. Not murder, thank goodness, but it showed how far envy can drive one. And what of Billy? Did anyone see what he was carrying or who he was with?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "Not a word about that, but he's been jumpy as a cricket, they say. Mrs. Price thinks he's hiding something, and I'm inclined to agree. Boys like that, with debts hanging over them, can get into all sorts of trouble. And Grayson wasn't kind, was he? always pushing for his money, from what I hear. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning to Billy's fear, so raw and unguarded. Debt could drive a young man to desperation, but to murder? She recalled a lad in the village who had stolen from a church collection to pay a gambling debt, his fear of exposure outweighing his good sense. Billy's nerves suggested knowledge, if not guilt. "And Mr. Jenkins?" she prompted. "His drinking seems to have caught attention." "Oh, Jane, it's dreadful," Mrs. Bantry said. "He's been at the Blue Boar every night, drinking more than he should. My maid says he was muttering about someone tampering and not his fault. Sounds like he's scared out of his wits, poor man. And Mr. Carver, well, he's been snapping at everyone, insisting his ride's perfect. But if that shed was unlocked, as they say, anyone could have got in, couldn't they?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her face remained serene. "Indeed, Dolly, an unlocked shed is like an open door in a village. Everyone notices who goes through it. That scrap of blue cotton I saw there might belong to anyone, but it's a clue, all the same. And Mr. Lyle's tool bag, most intriguing. I wonder if Inspector Craddock has heard these stories." She set down her cup, her needles pausing as she considered the tapestry forming in her mind. Lyle's ambition, Billy's debt, Jenkins's fear, Carver's pride. Each was a thread, but the village's whispers added color and shape to the pattern. She rose, smoothing her skirt. "You've been a great help, Dolly," she said. "I think I shall have a word with Inspector Craddock tomorrow to see what he makes of these tales. The truth, you know, is often hidden in what people say without thinking." Mrs. Bantry beamed, delighted to have contributed, and bustled out with promises to keep her ears open. As the door closed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking in the quiet. The Carnival's lights glowed faintly through her window, a reminder of the mystery that awaited. She thought of Lyle's tool bag, Billy's skulking, Jenkins' mutterings, and Carver's defensiveness, each a stitch in a design that was growing clearer. The truth, she knew, was close, waiting to be unraveled by a careful hand. With a quiet resolve, she set her knitting aside and prepared for bed, her mind already planning her next steps in the morning light. Chapter 9. The Alibi's Crack. The morning air in St. Mary's Mead carried a crisp edge, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the shadow of Harold Grayson's death to lift. The Carnival, though still open, operated with a subdued hum, its music a faint echo of its former exuberance. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, walked toward the village hall, where Inspector Craddock had set up a temporary base for his inquiries. Her conversations with Jenkins, Carver, Lyle, and Billy, combined with Mrs. Bantry's village gossip, had woven a tapestry of motives and opportunities, fear, pride, ambition, desperation, but the truth remained just out of reach, like a stitch dropped in a complex pattern. Today, she hoped to test the alibis of her suspects, knowing that a single inconsistency could unravel the entire design. The village hall was a modest building, its walls adorned with notices for flower shows and church fetes, now overshadowed by the grim purpose of Craddock's investigation. Inside, the inspector sat at a trestle table, his notebook open and his face etched with the strain of a case that refused to resolve. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression brightening with a mix of relief and curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, rising to offer her a chair. "I was hoping you'd stop by. This case is a tangle, and your insights are worth more than half my team." Miss Marple smiled, settling into the chair with her usual unhurried grace. "You're too kind, Inspector," she said, her knitting needles emerging from her bag to work a row of pale blue wool. "I've merely been listening to the village, and it has a great deal to say. Have you had any luck with the suspects' alibis? People, you know, often betray themselves in the details of where they were, or weren't." Craddock nodded, flipping through his notebook. "I've checked their stories, and they're holding, mostly. Jenkins says he was at the Blue Boar until closing, about 11, the night before the accident. The barman confirms he was there, drinking heavily, but left alone. Carver claims he was at home after his meeting in Much Benham, back by 10, and his neighbor saw his lights on. Lyle says he was with his wife at their house in Much Benham, and she backs him up. Billy was in the Carnival bunkhouse, or so he says, though the other workers say he stepped out for a bit, claiming he was checking the rides. None of it's airtight, but nothing's broken yet either." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes thoughtful. "How interesting," she said. "Alibis are like knitting, Inspector. One loose thread can unravel the whole piece. Mr. Lyle's wife, for instance, did she say what time they were together? And Billy's absence from the bunkhouse, how long was he gone?" She spoke lightly, but her questions were precise, honed by years of observing the small inconsistencies that revealed larger truths. Craddock leaned back, rubbing his chin. "Good point. Mrs. Lyle said they had dinner together. Then she went to bed early, around 9. She assumed Lyle was home all evening, but she didn't actually see him after that. As for Billy, the bunkhouse lads say he was gone maybe half an hour, around 10. Said he was doing his rounds, but no one saw him at the rides. It's not much, but it's enough to make you wonder." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Mrs. Bantry's gossip about Lyle's tool bag and Billy's skulking. "I think, Inspector, it might be worth speaking to Mrs. Lyle myself," she said. "A wife's memory can be selective, especially when her husband is under suspicion. And Billy's rounds, perhaps we could ask the carnival workers if they saw anyone else near the whirlwind that night. The village has been whispering about Mr. Lyle's presence, you know, and whispers often hold a grain of truth." Craddock agreed, and they set out for Much Benham, a short drive from St. Mary's Mead. Mrs. Lyle lived in a handsome Georgian house, its windows gleaming with prosperity. She was a slight woman with nervous hands and a face that might have been pretty, but for the strain etched into it. She received them in a drawing room filled with polished furniture, her manner polite but guarded. "Inspector, Miss Marple," she said, offering tea with a trembling hand. "I've told you everything I know. My husband was home that evening after dinner. I'm sure of it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of kindly concern. "Of course, Mrs. Lyle," she said. "It must be so distressing with all this talk. You mentioned dinner. Such a lovely ritual, isn't it? I recall a couple in St. Mary's Mead who always dined together, but one night the husband slipped out, and no one thought to question it until later. You went to bed early, I understand?" Mrs. Lyle's fingers tightened on her cup, and she hesitated, her eyes flickering. "Yes, around 9, she said. "I was tired, and Harold, Mr. Lyle, said he'd be working in his study. I assumed he stayed in, but I was asleep, you see. I didn't hear him leave, if he did." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the crack in her certainty, like a flaw in a carefully woven fabric. "Quite understandable," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking softly. And you didn't hear him come to bed later? Or perhaps notice if he'd been out, say, to the carnival? Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching for any telltale sign. Mrs. Lyle's cheeks flushed, and she set down her cup. No, I don't think so. He was home in the morning as usual, but I suppose he could have gone out. He's always busy, you know, with his business. Her words faltered, and Miss Marple saw the doubt in her eyes, the realization that her husband's alibi was not as solid as she had claimed. Back in the village, Craddock and Miss Marple visited the Carnival bunkhouse, a cramped shed where the workers slept. A grizzled man named Tom, who oversaw the crew, confirmed Billy's story with a grunt. Aye, he left for a bit, said he was checking the rides. Gone maybe 20 minutes, not more. Didn't see him near the whirlwind, though, and no one else was about, far as I know. He scratched his head, then added, Mind you, I saw that fancy fellow, Lyle, near the grounds earlier that evening, before dark. Looked like he was waiting for someone, but he scarpered when he saw me. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind weaving these new threads into the pattern. Lyle's alibi was crumbling, and Billy's absence, though brief, placed him near the scene. She thought of a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a young woman's flimsy alibi had collapsed under gentle questioning, revealing not guilt but fear of her lover's crime. Thank you, Tom, she said. It's the small things, you know, that make all the difference. As they left the bunkhouse, Craddock turned to her, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. You've done it again, Miss Marple. Lyle's story is shaky now, and Billy's not much better. But we're still short of proof. That scrap of cotton from the shed, my men say it's common, could belong to half the carnival workers. And the knife was clean, no prints. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. Proof, Inspector, is like a stitch in time. It comes when you least expect it. I think we should gather our suspects together, perhaps at the village hall. People reveal themselves when they're watched, especially when they think they're safe. She adjusted her shawl, her mind already planning the next step, as the carnival's lights glowed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the truth waiting to be unraveled. Chapter 10. The Motive Unraveled. The morning sun bathed St. Mary's Mead in a deceptive calm, its golden light gilding the village's thatched roofs and the carnival's fading banners. The whirlwind, still cordoned off, loomed like a silent accusation, its steel arms catching the light in a way that seemed almost mocking. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a constant companion, walked toward the village hall with a quiet determination. Her inquiries had woven an intricate tapestry of motives: Jenkins's fear, Carver's pride, Lyle's ambition, Billy's desperation, and the alibis, particularly Lyle's, had begun to fray like a poorly stitched seam. The village's whispers, the cut harness, the unlocked shed, and the scrap of blue cotton were all threads pointing to a deliberate act, but the final pattern required one more careful tug. She had proposed a meeting at the village hall, ostensibly to discuss carnival safety, but her true aim was to observe the suspects together, knowing that truth often slipped out in the tension of shared suspicion. The hall was abuzz with villagers, their chatter a low hum as they gathered under the pretense of community concern. Inspector Craddock stood at the front, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of wary anticipation. Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her straw hat tilted slightly, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked a row of pale blue wool. The suspects were all present. Mr. Jenkins, twisting his greasy rag, his eyes darting nervously. Mr. Carver, arms crossed, his scowl a shield against scrutiny. Mr. Lyle, polished and charming, though his smile seemed strained. And young Billy, hovering near the door, his face pale and his hands buried in his pockets. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and Miss Marple's keen eyes missed nothing. The way Jenkins avoided Lyle's gaze, how Carver glared at Billy, and the subtle tension in Lyle's posture as he greeted the villagers. Craddock opened the meeting, his voice steady but firm. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "We're here to discuss the safety of the carnival in light of Mr. Grayson's tragic accident. We've reason to believe the whirlwind's harness was tampered with, and we're asking for any information that might help us understand what happened." His eyes swept the room, lingering on the suspects, and Miss Marple noted the way each reacted. Jenkins' flinch, Carver's stiffening, Lyle's careful neutrality, Billy's nervous shuffle. She rose, her manner as unassuming as ever, and addressed the room. "It's a dreadful thing, isn't it?" she said, her voice gentle but carrying. "A machine so carefully built, yet undone by a single cut. I was looking at the harness yesterday with Inspector Craddock, and it struck me how precise that cut was, just enough to weaken it, so it would fail under strain. Whoever did it knew the ride well, or had a sharp mind for such things." She paused, her needles clicking, and saw Lyle's smile flicker, a brief crack in his composure. Jenkins spoke up, his voice rough. "I checked them harnesses, miss, I swear, every one, before the ride started. If there was a cut, it happened before my checks, or after." His eyes darted to Lyle, then away, and Miss Marple noted the accusation in his glance. Carver snorted, his voice sharp. "If you'd checked properly, Jenkins, we wouldn't be here. My whirlwind is perfect. Those harnesses were tested to withstand anything. Someone got into that shed and meddled, and it wasn't me." His glare shifted to Billy, who shrank back, his face flushing. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained serene. "The shed, yes," she said. "Such a curious thing that it was left unlocked. Mr. Carver, you said you might have forgotten to lock it, but Mr. Jenkins noticed it open later that night. And Mr. Lyle, I believe you were seen nearby, with a tool bag, were you not?" Her tone was mild, but her words landed like a carefully placed stitch, and she saw Lyle's hand tighten on the arm of his chair. Lyle laughed, a shade too hearty. "A tool bag? Village gossip, Miss Marple. I was taking a walk, nothing more. I've no reason to tamper with a ride. I'm a businessman, not a saboteur." His charm was intact, but Miss Marple caught the edge in his voice, the way his eyes flicked to Craddock, assessing the threat. Billy, his voice barely audible, stammered, I was just checking the rides like I told you, miss. I didn't go in the shed, honest." His hands twisted in his pockets, and Miss Marple saw the fear in his eyes, raw and unguarded, like a boy caught in a lie. She nodded, her needles clicking steadily. "Of course, Billy," she said. "Though it's curious, isn't it? How many people were near the whirlwind that night? I recall a case in St. Mary's Mead where a young woman was seen near a stolen bicycle, but it was her suitor who took it to impress her. People often see more than they say, and sometimes less than they think." She turned to Lyle, her voice soft but probing. "That contract with Mr. Grayson, Mr. Lyle, it must have been quite a blow, losing it to him. I understand it was a significant opportunity." Lyle's smile tightened, and he leaned forward, his voice smooth but cold. "Business is full of losses, Miss Marple. Grayson played sharp, but that's no reason to wish him dead. I was home with my wife, as she told you." His words were confident, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes avoided Craddock's. Craddock stepped in, his tone measured. "Mrs. Lyle's statement leaves some gaps, Mr. Lyle. She was asleep by 9, and you could have left the house. We've a witness who saw you near the whirlwind with a bag, and your engineering background gives you the skill to make that cut. Care to explain?" The room fell silent, the villagers leaning forward, their eyes fixed on Lyle. His charm faltered, and for a moment Miss Marple saw the calculation in his gaze, like a man weighing his options. "I've nothing to hide," he said at last. "I was near the carnival, yes, but I didn't touch the ride. You've no proof, Inspector." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple sensed the strain beneath it, like a thread stretched to breaking. She spoke again, her voice gentle but relentless. "Proof is a curious thing, Mr. Lyle. It's often in the small details, a tool bag, a cut strap, a man's ambition. In St. Mary's Mead, a gardener once poisoned a rival's roses over a petty grudge. It wasn't murder, but it showed how far envy can drive one. That contract meant a great deal to you, didn't it?" She watched him closely, her needles pausing, and saw a flicker of something, anger perhaps, or fear, cross his face. The meeting ended with no confessions, but Miss Marple felt the pattern shifting, the threads aligning. As the villagers dispersed, she lingered, watching the suspects leave. Jenkins hurried out, his rag twisted tightly. Carver strode off, his scowl deeper. Billy slipped away, his eyes downcast. But Lyle lingered, speaking to a villager with forced ease, his glance darting to Miss Marple. She met his gaze, her expression serene, and knew he felt the net tightening. Outside, she conferred with Craddock, her voice low. "Lyle's alibi is the weakest, Inspector, and his motive the strongest. That tool bag, his engineering skill, his presence at the shed, they point to him. But we need more than whispers. Perhaps a closer look at his movements, or what that bag contained." Craddock nodded, his face resolute. The carnival's lights glowed faintly, and Miss Marple felt the truth drawing closer, like a pattern emerging from a loom, ready to be revealed with one final tug. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The midday sun hung over St. Mary's Mead, its light filtering through the village's ancient oaks, casting dappled shadows on the cobbled streets. The carnival, now in its final days, carried on with a forced gaiety, its music a thin veneer over the tension that gripped the village. The whirlwind remained silent, its police tape a stark reminder of Harold Grayson's death, and Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, felt the weight of the mystery drawing to a close. Her inquiries had unraveled a tapestry of motives: Jenkins's fear, Carver's pride, Billy's desperation, and Lyle's ambition, and the threads now pointed unmistakably to the latter. The village hall meeting had exposed the fragility of Lyle's alibi, and the whispers of his tool bag, his engineering skill, and his rivalry with Grayson formed a pattern too clear to ignore. With a quiet resolve, Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Craddock to Much Benham, determined to confront Lyle and tug the final thread that would reveal the truth. Lyle's office was a handsome affair, perched above his textile warehouse, its windows overlooking the bustling streets of Much Benham. The room was furnished with dark wood and leather, exuding the prosperity of a man who had clawed his way up from modest beginnings. Lyle sat behind a polished desk, his suit as impeccable as ever, but his smile, when he greeted them, was strained, like a mask beginning to slip. "Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple," he said, rising with a nod. "To what do I owe this visit? More questions about the carnival, I presume?" His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed lightly on the desk. Craddock, his notebook at the ready, took a seat, his expression stern but calm. "We're here about the whirlwind, Mr. Lyle," he said. "New information has come to light, and we need to clarify your movements the night before Mr. Grayson's death. Your alibi, I'm afraid, doesn't hold up as well as you'd like." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting needles emerging to work a row of pale blue wool, their soft click a steady counterpoint to the tension in the room. She watched Lyle closely, her eyes as sharp as ever beneath her serene exterior. "It's a terrible thing, Mr. Lyle," she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. "To lose a man like Mr. Grayson in such a way. The harness, you see, was cut, deliberately, with a precision that suggests knowledge of the ride's mechanics. And you, with your engineering past, were seen near the whirlwind that night, carrying a tool bag." Lyle's smile faltered, and he leaned back, his hands clasping the arms of his chair. "I've told you, Miss Marple, I was merely taking a walk. As for a tool bag, village gossip, nothing more. I've no reason to harm Grayson, and no proof says otherwise." His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his eyes, like a man sensing a trap. Craddock flipped open his notebook, his voice measured. "Your wife, Mrs. Lyle, says she went to bed at 9 that evening, leaving you alone. You could have left the house, gone to the carnival, and returned without her knowing. Witnesses place you near the maintenance shed, and your engineering training gives you the skill to make that cut. Then there's the contract. Grayson's win cost you dearly, didn't it?" Lyle's composure cracked, his face flushing with a sudden anger. "Grayson was a thorn, I'll admit," he snapped. "He undercut me, played dirty to get that contract. But kill him? That's absurd. I'm a businessman, not a murderer." His hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted the sweat beading on his brow, despite the cool room. She tilted her head, her needles clicking softly. "Business can be a fierce thing, Mr. Lyle," she said. "In St. Mary's Mead, I knew a shopkeeper who sabotaged a rival's delivery just to gain an edge. It wasn't murder, but it showed how far ambition can drive one. That contract was your chance to outshine Grayson, wasn't it? And with him gone, you stood to gain." Lyle's eyes narrowed, but he forced a laugh, though it rang hollow. "You're grasping at straws, Miss Marple. Yes, I wanted that contract, but I didn't need to kill for it. The harness could have been cut by anyone. Jenkins with his sloppy checks, or Carver, who's so proud he'd rather blame others than admit a flaw. Even Billy, that skittish boy, had reason to hate Grayson." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her voice took on a quiet intensity. "The harness, Mr. Lyle, was cut with care by someone who knew exactly where to weaken it. The maintenance shed was unlocked, and you were seen nearby with a tool bag that could have held a knife. Your alibi is shaky, and your motive, ambition, stung by Grayson's success, is clear. In my village, I've seen men do desperate things for less. A small act, like cutting a strap, could seem so simple, couldn't it? Especially if you thought it would look like an accident." Lyle's face darkened, and for a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then, with a sudden snarl, he slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough of this," he spat. "You've no proof, just old women's tales and a meddling spinster's theories. Yes, I was near the carnival, and yes, I hated Grayson. He was ruining me, taking everything I'd worked for. I cut that strap, thinking it'd scare him, make him look a fool when the ride stopped. I didn't mean for him to die." His voice broke, and he slumped back, his face pale, as if the confession had drained him. Craddock's eyes widened, but he kept his composure, jotting notes swiftly. "You're admitting to sabotage, Mr. Lyle," he said. "That's a serious crime, and it led to Grayson's death. You'll need to come with us." Lyle's defiance crumbled, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't want him dead," he muttered. "I just wanted him humiliated, out of the way. The ride was supposed to malfunction, not kill him. I used my old tools, slipped into the shed. It was easy, with Carver's carelessness. I thought it'd be blamed on the ride, not me." His voice was hollow, and Miss Marple saw the weight of his actions settle over him, like a man realizing too late the cost of his ambition. She set her knitting aside, her expression one of quiet sorrow. "Ambition is a dangerous thing, Mr. Lyle," she said. "It blinds us to consequences. In St. Mary's Mead, a man once tampered with a rival's cart, thinking it a harmless prank. It caused an injury, and he never forgave himself. You meant to harm, even if not to kill, and that was enough." Craddock signaled to an officer waiting outside, who entered to escort Lyle away. As they left, Lyle's head bowed. Miss Marple felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved. The carnival's lights, visible through the window, seemed dimmer now, their promise of joy tainted by human folly. She rose, her knitting bag in hand, and followed Craddock out, her mind already turning to the village's healing, now that the truth was laid bare. Chapter 12. The Carnival Departs. The sun dipped low over St. Mary's Mead, casting a gentle glow across the village as the carnival began its final preparations to depart. The whirlwind, its steel arms now dismantled, was being packed onto lorries, its once menacing silhouette reduced to a jumble of metal and canvas. The village, though still abuzz with whispers of Harold Grayson's death, seemed to exhale, as if relieved to see the carnival's bright lights fade. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked a final row on the pale blue shawl for her niece's baby. The mystery was solved, the truth laid bare in Lyle's confession, but her thoughts lingered on the human frailties that had woven such a tragic tapestry. Fear, pride, desperation, and ambition, each a stitch in a pattern she had unraveled with quiet persistence. The village hall, so recently a stage for tension, was now quiet, its notices for flower shows and choir practices restored to their usual prominence. Inspector Craddock had called on Miss Marple that afternoon, his face weary but relieved, to share the final details of the case. Lyle had been taken to Much Benham for formal charges, his confession of sabotage, intended as a cruel prank but resulting in murder, securing his fate. The knife from the maintenance shed, though wiped clean, had been matched to a set in Lyle's possession, and the scrap of blue cotton, while inconclusive, aligned with a work shirt he admitted to wearing that night. The case, Craddock said, was as tight as they could hope, thanks to Miss Marple's keen eye. She welcomed him into her sitting room, the fire crackling softly, and the scent of tea filling the air. "You've done wonders, Miss Marple," Craddock said, settling into an armchair with a cup in hand. I'd have chased Jenkins or Billy for weeks, but you saw through Lyle's charm from the start. How do you do it? It's as if you read people like a book." Miss Marple's smile was modest, her needles clicking in rhythm. "It's merely observation, Inspector," she said. "People are much the same, whether in St. Mary's Mead or a carnival. They wear their hearts in their glances, their fears in their hesitations. Mr. Lyle's ambition was his undoing, bright and sharp, like a needle, but it pierced more than he intended. I've seen it before, in a village shopkeeper who overreached and lost everything. Human nature doesn't change, only the setting." Craddock nodded, his expression one of admiration tinged with amusement. "You make it sound simple, but I'd wager there's no one else in this village who could have pieced it together. The cut harness, the tool bag, the shaky alibi. Even that scrap of cotton. You noticed it when my men missed it entirely." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Small things, Inspector, are often the key. In St. Mary's Mead, a missing button once led to a thief's confession. The carnival was a stage, and Mr. Lyle played his part too well, until the curtain fell." She paused, her needles stilling. "And the others? Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Carver, young Billy, how are they faring?" Craddock sighed, setting down his cup. "Jenkins is back at work, though he's sworn off the bottle, or so he says. Carver's furious his whirlwind is tainted, but he's already sketching a new ride, muttering about foolproof designs. Billy's shaken, but relieved. His debt to Grayson's been settled by the estate, and he's promised to steer clear of cards. They're all bruised, but they'll mend, thanks to you." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the window, where the last of the carnival's lorries rumbled down the lane, their lights fading into the dusk. The village was returning to its quiet rhythm, its secrets laid bare, and its wounds beginning to heal. She thought of Lyle, his ambition a fire that had consumed more than he planned, and of Grayson, whose sharp dealings had sparked a fatal resentment. Human nature, she mused, was a complex weave, its beauty marred by flaws that only patience could unravel. As Craddock rose to leave, he paused at the door. "You'll let me know if another mystery crops up, won't you?" he said, half joking. "I'd rather have you on my side than half the force." Miss Marple's laugh was soft, like the rustle of leaves. "I'll be here, Inspector, with my knitting and my roses, but I hope St. Mary's Mead will be quiet for a while." She saw him out, then returned to her chair, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. The carnival was gone, its lights extinguished, but the village remained, its stories as endless as the wool in her hands. With a quiet smile, she knitted on, content that the truth, like a well-made shawl, had been crafted with care.